So, are you really a psychic? Mrs. Conroy asked from across the large oak desk of the study which served as her office. She took the small wire-framed glasses which hung from her neck by a long old-fashioned sterling silver chain and placed them on her face as she scrutinized Angelica carefully with pale, squinting eyes. Angelica bit her lower lip as she refrained from spewing the nasty, scathing bout of sarcasm which immediately threatened to launch from her mouth at the small southern woman. Instead, she took a deep breath and smiled sweetly before replying, "Yes, I am, Mrs. Conroy, just like it says at the beginning of the show." The older woman's enthusiasm was unrepentant as she seemed to be nearly vibrating in her chair with excitement. "You know, I watch you all the time. I just wish it wasn't so late. I have to be here at 6 every morning to get ready for the first tour, but I catch you every time I can. I'm fascinated by supernatural phenomena. That's one of the things which drew me to this job." Charlotte Conroy gazed around the study with a sense of reverence as Angelica caught a brief glimpse of her recollections concerning her own numerous encounters within the ancient house. Angelica had little doubt that Mrs. Conroy was utterly convinced of the mansion's haunted status. "A spot on your show could really be good for business. I mean, this place has so much historical value, and our tours are more or less just history lessons, but it's the spooky stuff which really brings them in. Thankfully, there are those who are still fascinated by Mr. Duresque's life and work, but people just love the ghost stories. I guess what I really want to know is there anything I can do to encourage the more spiritual aspects of your documentary?" Even if Angelica had not been psychic, the smile on the tour guide/proprietor's lips more than explained what she was hinting at. Everywhere Angelica went, she was always getting the same offer. If she declared the site as truly haunted and did her best to ham up her reactions to said phenomenon, then maybe there would be a little something extra for her after filming. This was common trade in the world of supernatural journalism, but not a practice in which Angelica indulged. I assure you, Charlotte, that anything of interest to the viewers at home will be documented thoroughly by my crew, and if there is any spiritual activity here, we will find it." Miss Conroy nodded approvingly, and Angelica sensed relief as she was sure that Duresque Foundation Trust had little to offer financially. "I wouldn't have expected any less from the Oprah Winfrey of the occult." Angelica cringed inwardly at the sound of her new mantle being used audibly in her presence, even though she knew the woman meant it fully as a compliment. "So, how would you like to do this?" Charlotte's bubbly demeanor was slightly annoying, but it beat the cynicism she met from many by miles. "Well, to showcase the house's history, I would ask you to take me and my crew on a standard tour, but it will be only us tonight. This way you can share interesting facts concerning the house as we film, and I will add whatever impressions I get as my guys record any events." Angelica did not do the standard ghost hunt, as it was usually a waste of time and would make the show seem contrived. Angelica was a true post-cognitive psychic, and if there were any supernatural energies present, and there almost always were, she usually brought them out in droves by virtue of her presence alone. "Oh, that sounds delightful." Charlotte was almost giggling with glee. "When? How about tonight?" "Fantastic!" Charlotte studied the tall, broad-shouldered woman with her dark hair and white widow's peaks with awe. She decided that even if she were not a celebrity, she probably still would have liked Angelica, despite her slightly intimidating aura. She had always wondered about the woman's lineage. Her naturally dark skin hinted at some native or Eastern heritage, but her green, shining eyes were anything but. "We will get here around 7, after your last tour of the day." "I'll be waiting." It was mid-spring and the sun was just setting over the hills as the two black men unloaded equipment from the SUV in the small visitors' parking lot behind the house. Charlotte watched Angelica stepping from the passenger side talking on the cell phone, and once more wondered at her luck. When she had sent the email to the large satellite network, she had been hopeful, but never would have dreamed a week later that an angel Love herself would be showing up to film. Charlotte Conroy. These are my associates, Ryan and Jesse Rose. Ryan does sound recording and mixing, while Jesse does computer editing and cameras. The two brothers nodded congenially as they checked the camera and microphone. Ryan was a tall, well-built, with long dreadlocked hair, while his brother was shorter and slender, with his head shaven clean. Angelica did not mention that the two were in fact her full-time security staff, and that acting as her crew for these little expeditions was more of a hobby than profession. However, filming these outings had become an ingenious method of getting the network to pay for her investigations all over the country. "Well, it's okay to get started then," Charlotte announced as she turned and entered through the conspicuously small front door. "Oh, one more thing, Miss Love," she said, turning suddenly before Angelica had crossed the threshold. "Just to be clear, I wanted to mention this earlier, but it slipped my mind." Angelica stared at her with surprise as she caught a sudden grim tone of ominous warning in the woman's Carolina accent. "I would greatly prefer it if we would steer clear of any topics concerning the more lurid rumors concerning Mr. Dreck's personal life." She said the words with the utmost restraint, as if even hinting at their subject brought her great pain. "Of course," Angelica's reply brought a chuckle from Ryan, whom she shot a scalding glance. They were all aware of Johann Duresk's infamous personal history, as it had been a subject of debate amongst fans, critics, and biographers for over a century. Ryan was laughing because, as they all three knew, skirting these events would be close to impossible. Charlotte's eyes were pleading, and Angelica could practically hear her begging within her mind. "Please, just let this work." Angelica gave the woman a compassionate smile, and with a deep breath, the tour began. It was said that if you threw a party and Johann Duresk was there, then that was all the entertainment you would require. Give the man a glass of scotch and a cigar, and let him start talking. Charlotte led them into the large front hall, to the massive red-carpeted staircase where she presented it with a grandiose wave. It was here that celebrities, statesmen, and artists from all around the world came to spend weeks in his company and, of course, attend his legendary dinners. It was on these stairs where Johann would talk to his gathered guests at great length on any given subject. Of all his accomplishments, Johann Duresk was known for his lectures, which he had elevated into an art unto itself. By the end of his long career, he was the highest paid public speaker in American history. Angelica's mind had begun its sponge-like absorption of every time which filled the air, and images of people eating, drinking, and listening were producing themselves like an alternative experience over her present perception. Yes, she could hear someone speaking, a distinct male voice which rang out hypnotically over the throngs. People had indeed loved to hear him talk. In an age before television and computers, there had been something about the man's ability to communicate which had enwrapped his listeners completely. She could almost hear his words, and after a moment of quiet entrancement, she was sure he was speaking about Socrates. A man who knew that his only wisdom derived from ignorance, my friends. His power was derived almost exclusively from his keen ability to question himself and to question others, especially those who claimed to be wise. To this day, visitors and cleaning staff have claimed to have felt this presence as they climbed these stairs. As she spoke, Jesse quickly moved the camera upwards as he noticed the large antique chandelier hanging alight with shining crystalline glass was beginning to sway rhythmically. Miss Conroy's face lit with excitement and pride as the light began to flicker. She held out her hands as if she were the hostess of a game show revealing the grand prize. Angelica eyed the display calmly as she felt a sudden gust of freezing cold air pass over her skin. "It appears we have drawn the attention of the master of the house," Charlotte announced. Let us continue first into the study before we go upstairs." The three followed her cautiously as Ryan gently touched Angelica's arm and whispered, "That was pretty quick, even for you, Angel." His eyes were anxious as he began to replay the sound from the first few minutes into his earphones. "Did you get anything?" she asked as she leaned in and heard Miss Conroy's voice from the headset. "Yeah, in the background I'm almost sure I could hear a voice. It's male, I'm sure. It sounds like he's speaking formally." "This place is no joke, Ryan. It's swimming in alternate energy." They looked up and saw Charlotte waiting expectantly at the enormous French doors to the study. They had noticed that despite the house's understated outward appearance, the interior was lush and richly designed in a personal cornucopia of styles. As they apologetically hurried through the room, Angelica paused in awe of the massive downstairs chamber known simply as the library. "As you can see," Charlotte began after waiting for the camera to begin rolling once more, "this was no private reading chamber. Like almost every room in downstairs of the house, it was designed for the entertaining of guests. It was here that Johann held all-night discussions with some of the world's most influential people of the time." Angelica marveled at the lush, comfortable aesthetic which intermingled with the vast collection of books, maps, and framed sketches with coalescent ease. These items seemed packed into every square of available space almost obsessively, giving the impression that their owner had kept them in constant use. She gazed at the large round table and saw in her mind's eye its surface covered in numerous documents and sketch pads, while ashtrays smoked with cigars and half-empty scotch sifters used as paperweights. She saw two men seated at the table, one a medium-built, dark-skinned man with wild salt and pepper hair and thick white mustache, who she instantly recognized as Johann Durisk. The other was a heavily built, bearded gentleman with the red, flared face of a heavy drinker and the intimidating demeanor of someone uncomfortable with their own authority. "I've lost half the Republicans over these damn Southerners, Johann," the bearded man said with frustration as he refilled his own glass. "They want to blame me for this recession, but are unwilling to acknowledge that the country has lost a huge economic force with the end of the Old South." "They want to bake their cake and eat it too," Johann chuckled as he eyed the headlines of a newspaper declaring yet another revealed corruption scandal. "We ended slavery, but they still want the money. All I hear is how I can let the southern states go back into the hands of southern politicians. Who did they think was going to run the South? What am I supposed to do, divvy it up, everything under Missouri to the Union generals like it's the goddamn Dark Ages? What do they think Lincoln would have done differently?" "Your presidency exists in the shadow of a martyr, Ulysses," Johann said stoically. "Every scandal is another mark attesting to a lack of integrity in the comparison to a ghost who is fast attaining sainthood." Angelica snapped back into the present when she realized that Charlotte had ceased her speech and was staring at her with annoyance. "Are you okay, Miss Love?" the guide said, as if fighting to contain an urge to stomp her foot with impatience. "Yes, I'm very sorry. You were saying?" "I was saying that Johann Durisk's influence on the popular opinions of the American public carried far beyond the war, which many claimed he had helped start." "That's right, because his articles for the abolishment of slavery were thought to have been the match to the fire of the Civil War. He was of mixed heritage, I believe." "That is correct. Johann Durisk was born into poverty as what they referred to at that time as being a French mulatto. He was raised by his African-American mother, a free servant in the house of a wealthy tobacco grower in New Orleans named Pierre Durisk, who favored the young Johann from the time of his birth. Whether Pierre was Johann's actual father is unknown, but the man did give Johann his name as a gift in his teens. In his early adolescence, he discovered a gift for drawing, which subsequently led him to earning extra money for he and his 5 siblings doing sketch portraits on street corners, and eventually wealthy members of Southern families. At the age of 17, he was allowed to travel north and acquired a job as an illustrator for a small Boston newsletter. In time, he began to submit articles and eventually became a popular reporter. An extraordinary feat in such a bigoted and troubled time. Angelica reflected on what she had known of Johann's history, and noting some significant gaps in the biography given by Miss Conroy, remembered reading that Johann had reportedly learned to draw and write from Pierre Duresque himself. Rumors had persisted that the wealthy Frenchman had taken a special interest in Johann due to the boy's extraordinary wit, and many claimed physical attractiveness. Angelica avoided Ryan and Jesse's knowing glances, and was certain Charlotte had no inclination to discuss the theory that Johann had been given his rudimentary education by a wealthy pedophile that was most likely molesting him. "So, shall we go upstairs?" Charlotte brushed past them and headed back for the stairway. As they began to follow, the double door suddenly slammed shut and separated him from their host. Angelica rushed forward and reached for the handle, only to find it unbelievably cold into now nervously sweating flesh of her palms. She pulled at the icy ornate metal, and for several brief terrifying moments it seemed the portal would not budge. Then, as if acknowledging some supernatural prank, she felt the handle turn easily and the doors opened. Miss Conroy stood on the other side looking ruffled and confused, only for a moment before regaining her composure. "Oh my goodness!" the guide exclaimed as she patted her hair delicately. "That was quite the scare, wasn't it?" She was eyeing the doors as she nervously laughed in an attempt to mask her shock. Angelica knew that this had not been a normal manifestation for the house. She looked to Jesse, who, as he gave her a thumbs up, signifying that he had successfully recorded the event. "Please continue, Miss Conroy," Angelica said reassuringly. "Yes, of course," she replied, and turned to lead them up the large, curving stairway. This was the original bedchamber used by Mr. Duresque during his first marriage to the wealthy debutante widow known as Sarah Jane Bell. Johann scoffed at claims that he had married her explicitly for the purpose of gaining the funding needed to begin his own newspaper. Charlotte presented the room, which stood just off the left end of the second-floor landing, but did not offer to take them past the large red rope which hung between the sides of the doorway. He also scoffed at allegations that he had actually married the widow Bell because of his interest in her pubescent daughter. Angelica thought with revulsion as she felt the same distinct double reality feeling welling in her mind. She realized quickly that the coming impression felt remarkably tainted with painful, tearing emotion. But before she could prepare herself, she was already plummeting into the past echo, as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. The presence of two distinct personalities emerged within the room, as she heard their raised voices raging over the resounding booms of a thunderstorm. "I've seen you leering at her like a damn starving dog, Johann, and I will not let her be a victim of your sickness." The woman's words were slashing at the man like a drawn sword as he struggled to maintain his facade of cool, rational deliberation. "This is ridiculous, Sarah," he defended. "How could you even think such things?" He sounded so innocent that anyone listening would have thought him the victim of a lunatic's vicious delusion. However, Angelica realized quickly by the thoughts of the accuser that this was Johann's gift. His words were coercive and deceiving. He had swayed the course of history with his words and helped to reshape a broken country, hiding his many secrets within tangled webs of suggestion that had become akin to breathing for him. Angela could see him seated casually at the small table by the open balcony, smoking and drinking as he gazed off with intentional disinterest at the flashes of lightning over his beloved grove of flowering apple trees. "You're a devil, Johann. Maybe you are Lucifer himself for all I know. But you'll not get your hands on Lucy, and you'll never lay your diseased touch on me again." She was wearing her night clothes, a long white-sleeved dress that blew against her body in the wind from the storm outside. She had awakened and found him gone from their bed. She had crept from the room and followed the smell of his infernal cigar to her daughter's room. As she had pushed the door open, she had found him sitting by Lucy's bed, fondling the sleeping 15-year-old's hair with obvious loathsome abandon. Months of suspicion had been confirmed, and the dam, which had withheld the boiling waters of contempt and horror, had finally broken. "Then leave, Sarah," he sighed as if exhausted and bored. "Just go and do as you will. But be warned that should you utter even a whisper of your deranged fantasies to another living soul, I will see you dead." His voice was as even and unemotional as it would be were he explaining a particularly interesting afternoon meal. She had stared at him, shaking and cold with terror and disbelief. This man, this monster she had married, was threatening her life. Once again, Angelica flashed back into the present, where Ryan and Jessie were excitedly speaking to one another as Miss Conroy laughed, giddy with joy. "What is it?" she asked dazedly as she rubbed her temples warmly. "There were 2 images on the camera," Jessie laughed as Ryan stared over his shoulder at the camera's monitor. They were like blurred gray shadows in the room that showed up while Charlotte was talking. "That's not all," Ryan added as he tapped his headset. "We got audio, Angel. I've got 2 distinct voices talking in the background behind Charlotte. She gave me like 10 minutes with a mixer and I can bring them out. I'll bet we'll be able to understand them." Just as he spoke, the sound of cracking alerted them to something occurring in the room beside them. They turned and looked just in time to see the clear glass in the balcony doors implode into a shower of glittering, jagged glass. "Oh my God!" Charlotte yelled. Angelica had to physically restrain the woman from rushing into the room in a panic of concern over the priceless furniture within. "Stop, Charlotte!" Angelica ordered as she gripped the struggling woman's frail arms. The woman felt so slight in her grasp that she feared injuring her. "It might be dangerous for you in there. Just leave it and call someone tomorrow." Charlotte Conroy ceased her resistance and instantly began to smooth her blouse as she calmed, even though her eyes still remained locked on the scattered window glass with dismay. "Of course, it's just that everything in there is Mr. Durest's actual personal possessions. They are priceless objects, Miss Lee." "Yes, I understand, but let's just keep going and finish this up. This may be escalating into a dangerous situation." "Have you ever had experiences like this before?" The woman's voice was eager, with a very obvious desire for acknowledgement. "Not exactly like this, no." Angelica watched the same strange sense of satisfaction pass in a hidden smile over the woman's lips. This is making her happy, Angelica thought, as she verified her unease with Ryan and Jessie, who stood speechless and immobile. She couldn't help but wonder exactly what personal phenomenon the seemingly proper middle-aged Southern lady had experienced in the house. Mentally trying to slow the pounding of her racing pulse, Angelica followed as Charlotte continued the tour. In the years following his divorce, Johann devoted himself to the writing of his memoirs, which would, true to his nature, become a scathing social commentary on the life and conditions of people of color living in the South. It would be during this time that he would receive word that the last of his mother's siblings, his Aunt Gretchen, had finally succumbed to tuberculosis. On learning that her daughter, his young cousin, who was a girl of 12, was being kept at an orphanage in Baton Rouge, he immediately left to bring her home, where she would be raised in his household as an honored guest. Flora would become the center of his world for the next 3 years, until tragically, she passed away of a mysterious ailment, which is now guessed to have been a congenital heart defect. This was her room, which he kept untouched as a shrine to his devotion and love for the soul he knew so briefly, but which would influence him until the end of his days. Angelica stared into the small chamber, which seemed packed from floor to ceiling with every imaginable variation of stuffed animal and an inordinate collection of what was surely priceless antique china dolls. There was a small bookshelf on which sat carefully kept works of poetry, classic novels, and educational texts beside a plain child's writing table where Flora had sat for hours drawing and scribbling her lessons. Durest had ensured that the girl It had the most reputable governess money could buy, whose room was located far down the opposing hallway. There was the standing wardrobe, which had been filled with dresses of the finest quality, and a magnificent cedar wood full-length mirror where Angelica could almost see the lovely young girl standing quietly in the morning sunlight, brushing her long dark hair. In the hallway, over her shoulder like a breeze carried on the wind of distant time, she could hear Johann's voice saying, "Your services will no longer be required for the rest of the year, madame, as I fear Flora's health will not tolerate any additional mental strain." "But she seems fine," answered a well-bred Yankee woman's voice. "Yes, she does put on a brave face," he replied smoothly. "But I assure you the doctor has insisted that she discontinue her studies, at least until spring. You will, of course, be compensated in full, and I will contact you when she is able to continue." Angelica looked down the dimly lit hall and for a moment could almost see the two shadowy forms, while from the corner of her eye, for an instant, she thought she sensed a presence that had stood at the door listening in secret. All around her, the air seemed filled with fear and stark, hopeless terror. This was not the aura of the treasured guest who felt rescued from poverty, but the generated, powerful doubts and concerns of a prisoner who was watching as their last chance of salvation slipped away. "Angel, you've got to see this." Jesse's voice was low and urgent as he stared wide-eyed with trembling hands at the small screen viewer of the digital camera. Angelica quickly moved to his side and watched as he replayed the past several minutes of the recording. Beginning with a shot of Charlotte as she was speaking about Johann Drusk's generous adoption of his younger cousin, the camera had then gone into a slow sweep of the bedroom. It was only as it had begun to pass the ornate, hand-carved, full-length mirror that it froze on the cedar oval. There, in the clear glass, stood a dim, translucent shade with clear, colorless skin and eyes standing, motionless like the faded black and white portrait of some lost and forbidding soul. All the innocence and tranquil beauty which might have denoted this child in life had been transformed and drained by the insidious influence of death upon her features. Also, hidden behind the subtle emotionless mask of her round, colorless face was a furious inferno of ice-cold hatred. The girl's small, bloodless rosebud lips were moving in a repeated pattern of syllables, which Angel could not discern. She looked to Ryan. "Sound, Ryan. Did you get any sound?" "Definitely," he replied nervously. "But I'll need some time to isolate it. It's a phrase over and over like a chant. But it's all in a whisper. It's so freaky, Angel." Angelica looked to Charlotte, who was standing pressed against the wall with her shaking hands clasped over her face, as if summoning every ounce of her will in an attempt to repress the urge to cry, scream, laugh, or all combined together in one sublime spectacle of madness. "What is she saying, Miss Conroy?" "How would I know?" the woman sneered, suddenly venomous in her own defense, the expression of shame and rage now locked behind prideful self-righteousness. "Because you've heard her," Angelica answered, pointing at the mirror which stood an empty reflection to their combined stares. Don't be foolish," Charlotte said, her voice cracking awkwardly. "I'm no psychic like you." "No, but you've spent more time in this house alone than anyone else after these years. How many times have you seen Flora, Miss Conroy?" "Are we going to continue the tour or not?" Charlotte had now composed herself and reclaimed her long-practiced facade of ignorance. She turned and strode away from the doorway, her heels clacking against the hardwood floor as she made her way to the next smaller set of stairs, which lay waiting at the end of the hall. "We've got to be careful, Angel," Jessie whispered to her as they followed up the creaking narrow staircase leading to the third-floor attic. The spirit is using you as a facilitator to produce stronger manifestations. This woman has probably seen things, but nothing like we're experiencing tonight. I know, Jess, but she's going to want us to edit half of this and make this place look like the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. Maybe we should just leave this one on the cutting room floor altogether, Ryan commented as he watched the lights in the hallway behind them flicker and crackle within the bulbs. Maybe, but either way, we're going to finish the tour. This was Johann's private sanctuary. 3 years after Flora's death, he remarried, this time to an older woman from Philadelphia named Daniela Buffet, who would be his companion and nursemaid after he suffered a massive, debilitating stroke, which left him unable to speak clearly. It was here in his attic studio that he spent the last years of his life sketching and painting until his death. He fell down these very stairs during a hurricane, which devastated the Carolina coast in the summer of 1889. He had been working late into the night, and so loud was the noise of the storm that his fall remained undiscovered until the late hours of morning. Angelica studied the small, comfortable room until her eyes fell on the small bed which lay huddled against the wall in the far corner. She saw only darkness now through the filter of lost years and felt herself lying still and sweating in the cold. It was Johann, as he tossed and struggled in vain to find rest, as he listened for the gentle rustling of a dress gliding over the floor. Soft, padded footsteps approaching through the shadows, as he prayed to a God which he had so often professed to hold as false. Alone in the upper floor as the servants slept below in their quarters near the kitchen, he had been tormented by a presence which watched from the shadows of his lonely prison. Gone were the days of parties and famous guests. The rumors had driven them away, as his notoriety had been soiled by the suspicions and tales told after young Flora's passing. "Go away," he had whispered to the sound of the soft, even breaths as it pressed stifling and reeking of damp earth and decay. "Please, just leave me be," he had begged, feverish and quivering with terror as he saw the small pitch emptiness standing beside his bed. The cold hands touching his as it lifted his fingers and pressed them to a frail, lifeless chest, pulling his hand upwards to a dry, cool cheek as he heard the soft, familiar voice whisper, "Won't you touch me, Johann? Touch me like you did before." The small, frozen hands, frighteningly strong, pulling his grasp into hair which was soiled and moist with rain and mud. A scream frozen in his throat as the pounding in his head escalated into a drum within his ears. "You're dead. You're dead, and this is a dream." Johann stood, panting with a dazed and broken expression, alone and hollow from years of isolation and terror. All around the room were sketches and paintings of a young girl long dead. His hair had faded to white, and his face drooped as one arm curled useless at his side. A woman entered and stared at him with pity, disgust, and hatred. "I am your wife, Johann. You have not spoken a word to me in weeks, and yet you expect me to stay here and care for you like some sickened animal which should be by all rights put out of its misery." Outside, the wind was building, and lightning flashes over the overgrown, tangled mass of brush and weeds which had been his beloved apple grove. "What was she to you, that you should spend every waking moment portraying her likeness? I am your wife. Why don't you paint me? You have never once painted me. I'm leaving." She turned and and fled the room as his eyes followed her with terror. He struggled to call out, but the words would not form on his numb and useless lips. He could only moan as he struggled to the canvas and dipped the brush in red like the dress she wore, as she called to the servants to gather her things. "Look, Daniela," his mind cried out desperately. "I am painting you. Please do not leave." However, the shaking, the tremors which would not allow his hand to steady, the brush would only create a long and jagged smear, streaming line of crimson like a splash of blood across the canvas. The room was spinning as his heart pounded on and on with a frantic, uneven rhythm. He began to stumble from the door, grunting and coughing as he limped onto the stairs and looked down into the darkness. He could hear Daniela's footsteps below as she gathered her things. Desperately, he longed to call out, "Please, I think I'm having another." And then he heard the voice, the quiet, timid whisper from behind him as he felt the small, cold hands on the middle of his back. "Go to her, Johann," said the voice, and then came the push, a gentle shove which sent him flailing down the steps. He felt each unyielding edge driving into the brittle, snapping bones of his neck, back, and shoulders as he rolled and slid down the seemingly infinite steep decline. He lay gasping and wheezing as blood seemed to run from some breach within his skull down into the flooding sacs of his weak lungs. His vision was fading into blurs and clouds of dark moving shadow within color, but he could still see the black-laced boots beneath the hem of a long skirt approaching across the floor. His eyes moved like dry, sluggish stones in the throbbing caverns of their sockets as he looked up into the face of his wife. She was looking down with her cold, steel blue gaze, and in her expression he saw no pity or concern, only dry, calculating thought, as she realized that now she would inherit everything, and this idea had sparked joy and relief. She would be the rich widow of a famous dead legend, instead of a selfish, despised second wife who had abandoned an invalid in his decline. His hand reached up, broken and shaking, as he pleaded for her to do something, if only it were to comfort him in these last moments. Instead, he watched as she turned away and walked down the hall and extinguished the lamps as she went. He lay in the darkness waiting for death until he felt the icy damp form over him, her little arms reaching around him as the scent of mud and decay permeated his senses even now. "Don't worry, Johann," she whispered in his ear. "You are not alone. I am here." The small, ornate light covers which lined the hallway below exploded in a shower of sparks as Angelica fell backwards against the wall, her mind rushing to leave the nightmarish events she had just experienced behind. Ryan dropped the boom mic as he knelt at her side and carefully took her cheek in his hand and gazed at her eyes to gauge the dilation of her pupils. He was well versed in the physical traumas intense psychic occurrences could trigger, and was now checking her pulse as he timed the pounding of her heart on his wristwatch. Jesse now was digging in his shoulder bag as he produced prescription pills and a bottle of water. "What's going on?" Charlotte was saying as she stood wringing her hands helplessly as the two administered aid to the fallen talk show host. "Show's over, lady," Jesse said as he placed two powerful tranquilizers between Angelica's pale lips and carefully tilted the water bottle up to her mouth. "What are those pills? Is she sick?" Ryan noted that there was honest concern in the woman's voice and resisted his initial instinct to blame her utterly for Angelica's state. "They're nerve pills. When they take effect, they will block Angel's sensitivity to the energies here. She's being used as a conduit and psychic battery by the presence in the house to imprint events and create physical phenomena." "Will she be okay?" Charlotte gasped as she glanced at the still crackling socket of the lamp which sat by the curtains of the window. The long, shroud-like sheets of deep crimson rustled in the darkness despite the lack of moving air, as if something hid playfully behind them. Ryan and Jessie helped the dazed psychic to her feet as Jessie used the light of the camera to guide their way back down the stairs. Charlotte closed the door of the studio behind her and shivered with the eerie feeling that she was leaving a presence in the room with her departure. "I swear to you, it has never been like this." Charlotte was pouring clear rum into coffee cups from the cabinet of the kitchen as they sat at a small table beneath the clear light of the ceiling fan. The power surge which had driven them back downstairs had been exclusive to the top 2 floors, and here activity had died down to its normal, subtle low. "What did we get?" Angelica said, coughing, after having downed the entire contents of the mug which had been given to her. She held it up, again signaling for a refill. "Is that such a good idea with the pills you just took?" Charlotte hesitated before tipping the bottle. "I will worry about that, Miss Conroy. If you're that worried about my safety, you might have mentioned that Johann Duresk raped and murdered his cousin before we even started this." Charlotte dropped down into the kitchen chair and sat dejected and horrified as she seemed to struggle with some deep inner turmoil. She took several long drinks from her white coffee cup before straightening in her seat and facing the 3 sternly. "I did not think that is exactly what happened." "Then exactly what did you think?" Jessie said as he and Ryan began plugging in their devices into separate laptops. "I have studied the journals and recorded accounts of Mr. Duresk and several other people associated with him and Flora during her time here. I have on occasion over the years seen things around the house and was aware that Flora's spirit seemed to be present. I had come to the conclusion that almost undoubtedly, disturbing as it may be, Johann had developed very passionate and inappropriate feelings for her. However, at that period in time, a relationship of this sort, although frowned upon, would not have been viewed with the same illegality as it is now. People were close to them then, and even came to see Flora as Johann's wife, and it was even conjectured that at one point she had intended to marry him. So why didn't he?" Jessie had begun replaying the video of Flora's room as he spoke and was staring intently at the image he saw in the mirror with awe. "In my studies, I discovered a very terrible secret, something so horrifying, so wrong that I couldn't believe it until now." "More wrong than a 40-year-old man being romantically involved with his adolescent first cousin?" Ryan watched as he uploaded the video into his screen and began to mix the recorded sound with the playback. "Johann's mother did not have a sister." All eyes fell upon the small Carolina native. "What do you mean?" Angelica leaned forward in her seat. "I could find no record of Johann's mother having any siblings at all. But upon studying the timeline of events in Johann's journal with a death certificate from New Orleans and records from the orphanage at Baton Rouge, I realized that his mother had died previous to young Flora being placed in the orphanage. I do not believe that she was his cousin. I think she was, in fact, his little sister." Angelica finished as the light above them flickered threateningly. "Yes." Charlotte stared down shamefully before hastily filling the cup in her hands to the very top of the rim. After draining half the contents, Angelica took the bottle for yet another refill. "And I believe that just prior to his dismissal of the governess from New York, the woman had found out from young Flora herself. I believe the girl had exposed Johann in an attempt to gain her freedom, as she was most certainly with child. silence. And the governess never told anyone. Ryan spoke in shock as he pounded away at the keys of the computer, trying to correct a reoccurring glitch in the video feed. She never made it back to New York. She was assaulted on her way to the train station and found dead by the road along with the driver who had been escorting her. The only reason any evidence of her being taken into Flora's confidence exists is because of a letter she wrote to her own sister a month after she began touring. Guys, can you understand what the image in the mirror was saying? Angelica looked from one to the other as their eyes darkened. Something weird is going on here, Angel. Jesse was still typing with panicked, nervous angst as Ryan leaned back and cupped his hand over the inserted earphones with a long look of dazed disorientation. That's the understatement of the year. No, I mean the video file. Jesse finally looked up and met her gaze as Charlotte crept forward and glanced over Ryan's shoulder. What's it doing? Charlotte's face, first blushed with alcohol, now drained of color as she took the small pair of glasses from her pocket of her blouse and looped them over her ears. She stared through the tiny round lenses with incredulity as she pointed angrily at the screen with her one long, bony finger. What are you doing? Why does that bar say uploading? We're not doing anything, Jesse answered with hushed irritation. As soon as we turned on the laptops, they somehow connected to the house Wi-Fi network. What are you trying to pull? She scowled, as if she were an unruly schoolchildren. I didn't even give you the password. How could it do that? The video is being uploaded to the internet, Ryan said with awe, and Charlotte's composure melted into hysteria. No, stop it right now. This isn't part of the contract. I never agreed to this. I don't think Flora cares about the contract, Ryan stated as he tapped the escape key to no avail. Jesse was attempting to shut down his completely when suddenly an explosion of cold, invisible force propelled him backward into his chair and sent him flailing onto the white tiled floor. Where is it uploading to? Angel asked. She tried to attune herself to the presence, but found the pills and alcohol had succeeded in blocking her link to the house's energy. Ryan was now kneeling by his brother, who lay dazed and breathless from the burst which had knocked all air forcibly from his lungs. It looks like it's going to vids.com, Ryan answered, and Charlotte gasped with shock as she realized what this meant. Vids was the largest free filing sharing network in the world, originally created as a digital haven for America's lost catalogs of family VHS home movies, free to view by the public. It had escalated over the past decade into a formidable library of millions of video files, so easily accessible and grossly entertaining that it had surpassed YouTube overnight. The world had eventually grown weary of the staged melodramatics presented by turn-of-the-century reality television, and had in turn acquired an obsession for true recorded reality. When someone said that a clip had gone viral, it usually indicated that it had landed on vids.com. No, does that mean everyone will see it? Charlotte snatched Ryan's computer from the table and seemed on the verge of flinging it onto the floor when suddenly she froze. The three watched entranced as her body seemed to become rigid, as her arms violently shook, as if she were an incredibly resistant automaton who was forced into jerking, painful appearing movements to return the laptop to its previous position. Then suddenly, bolting upright with a horrible snap resounding from her spine, they watched as she began to spasm and convulse before falling to the floor, where her body writhed and twisted in paroxysms of acute agony. Her eyes rolled back into their sockets, and they watched helplessly as a dark stain of blood began to form on her dress below the line of her belt. Vast amounts of blood soaked the beige, flower print cloth as a scarlet pool began to form a widening circle around her. There were terrifying, muffled tearing sounds and half-heard cracks and breaks as her still living body was tormented from some relentless assault which seemed to originate within her torso. Finally, she lay motionless and still within the river of warm blood which had expelled from between her thighs. Angelica stood dazed and lost as her mind grappled to comprehend what she had just witnessed. She heard a voice whispering as if from the end of a long tunnel, and then realized it was Ryan as he called for an ambulance from his cell phone. As if in a dream, she turned the computer carefully until she could see the monitor, and there she saw the words, "Upload complete." Angelica walked down the hallway of her apartment and entered her bedroom, where she seated herself before her computer. She placed the glass of wine in her hand beside the keyboard and began the startup as she rubbed her eyes wearily. It had been a month since the terrifying events at the Dresk House had left her shattered and wandering dismally through the shadowy recollections of that dark night. There had been a full investigation and inquiries by the police, but an autopsy had shown that Charlotte Conroy had died of a series of violent seizures induced by a rare and aggressive form of advanced cancer of the nervous system. A number of tumors had been found in various points within her cerebrum and main nerve column, and the convulsions had seemingly disrupted several weak areas of her bowels and reproductive organs, which had been eaten away by the disease. Doctors had determined that the disease must have been forming passively, hidden for a number of years, only to erupt in a single crescendo of agony, which had left the woman bleeding out and dead. However, those millions of people who had seen the videos, which had been made in the house the night in question, already had developed quite a different theory. Many of Angelica's detractors had already labeled the entire escapade as a well-planned publicity stunt and utter hoax. However, to many, it had served only to solidify a growing belief in the paranormal and seal Angelica's status as queen of the occult. She had watched the videos countless times and had eventually been forced to bar herself from the website in order to preserve her sanity. But tonight, she had once been again called back to her computer, and once more she was logging on to the vids.com website. There, before her, on the main page, was the banner for the video still posted. She drained half of the glass of wine, her fourth that evening, and once more clicked on vid 18. There was Charlotte, talking as the camera panned around the room. There stood the large cedar mirror, and there, as always before, was the pale, translucent image of the small, adolescent girl speaking. At this point of the recording, Ryan's sound was looped onto the clip, and Angelica watched and listened as the soft, whispering voice began to merge with the moving, bloodless lips of the image. As she heard the word for perhaps the 10th, 11th, or 20th time, Angelica could see the blood soaking the dress of Charlotte's crotch as she convulsed on the floor of the Dresk House kitchen. Angelica took the computer mouse and clicked the sound back again so she could listen and hear as the apparition said, "I was very sick, and Johan said that he would call a doctor to come and take care of me. But when the man arrived, I knew that Johan had lied. They tied my wrists and ankles to the bed, and Johan tried to force me to drink laudanum, but I threw it up. The doctor asked Johan if he should stop, but Johan insisted it could wait no longer. He took an object from his small black bag, and they killed the little baby in my womb. I screamed and screamed as I bled and bled all over the sheets and floor. Johan watched and looked sad as he drank whiskey and smoked from a chair by the window. Once I thought he was crying, but I realize now that the devil has no tears. I was not sure for a very long time, but I think it is likely now that I might have died.